Scholar E.O. Wilson said that we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. It's true. With the exceedingly vast amount of information now available, it's becoming so very challenging to make any sense of it. The sheer complexity presented to us is causing people to opt for silos where they feel comfortable. So is the information age a good thing? How do we navigate it effectively? Lucy Crompton Reid and Professor Spiro are both in their unique ways seeking to help people do so. One facilitates open access knowledge, and the other seeks to prepare the mind, understand and address complexity. Let's join them in discussion.
Hello and welcome everyone to the inaugural Polymath Festival. It is my delight and pleasure to be here with you. My name is Crompton Reid, a composer, artist, creative entrepreneur, and cultural activist. I'm also delighted to be joined by Spiro, who is the godfather of cognitive flexibility, which you'll hear a lot more of later on. He hails from the University of Michigan. Also joined by Lucy Crompton Reid, who is the executive of Wikimedia UK. And also, many of you would know from television and University Challenge, the mathematician, writer, and teacher. Now today, we're talking about navigating the information age. And this is quite a poignant time to be talking about that, because we have been, for quite a few years, and some may say decades, in a period of heightened information conflict, misinformation, disinformation, and questions about trusted sources, mistrust of experts. And that's brought us, I think, in the last few years, from this side of the pond in the UK, the Brexit campaign about leaving the EU, to those at the other side of the pond in terms of their elections and conspiracy theories and a whole range of things which are spreading around the world. Meanwhile, we're blessed to have the technologies of the internet and of search engines, and to have access to wonderful e-learning platforms and courses that we can find online. So it seems like this couldn't be no time better in the world for engaging with information. Yet, we are juggling information management systems. We've inherited systems of power, authority, and rulership based upon centralized hierarchy, ratifications, organizations, division of labor, and at certain times, structural violence that would enforce what should be known, what shouldn't be known, to the extremity of book burning or censorship. All of these things, as a species, we've been dealing with for thousands of years, and most certainly since the dawn of the printing press, we have a history around the world of what has happened with how people engage with information, and as what? As free, natural, living human beings, as opposed to the way that our silicon-based Android super intelligent robots will be engaging with information and learning and dissemination, whether they're doing so as a member of a religious organization, a political party, a social peer group, and in society in general. There are different rules of what should be said, what shouldn't be said, what should be learnt by whom, what shouldn't, what is above one's pay grade, what is beneath one's pay grade. So within all of those various streams and rules of engagement, as we now look at navigating an intensified, technologically enabled, data-driven, personalized, algorithmic information age, there's a lot for us today to contemplate. So I'm now going to, I'm just fascinated is thinking about what I've just said in terms of navigating the information age, and how you personally navigate with information, not just in your professional lives in terms of your job titles, but just generally as a human being, from social to family and peer groups, as well as in your profession. And within that, to what degree do you have a cross-modal, multiple states of consciousness collaborating in your mind that could be an indication of polyphony? So, Lucy, may I go over to you on that?
Thank you very much, Paul. And thanks to the DaVinci Network, and in particular Waqas Ahmed, for inviting me to join the Polymath Symposium, and in particular this session, Navigating the Information Age, which could equally have been called Navigating the Misinformation Age, or on a personal note, Navigating the Age of Home Working, because I have a cat that won't leave me alone and a son that will hopefully won't bother me during the session, but who knows. So, but here's my little spiel about information and about Wikimedia. I'm Lucy Crompton Reid. I'm the Chief Executive of Wikimedia UK, and we're the national chapter for the global open knowledge movement. So we work with all of the Wikimedia projects and communities, of which Wikipedia is the most well known. And we believe that creating a resilient civil society is the best response to the threat to democracy that's presented by misinformation and disinformation. And building information literacy skills in young people is a key way of building that resilience. And we also believe, and we can demonstrate, that Wikimedia can play an important role in combating those issues and in developing the information and media literacy skills that are becoming increasingly fundamental to democratic engagement and a well-functioning civil society. So we are trying to address the challenge of misinformation and disinformation through our digital data and information literacy programme, which supports young people to become the producers and not just the consumers of knowledge and information. As one of the most trusted sources of information in the world, which is created and curated by volunteers and edited in real time, contributing to Wikipedia has a powerful impact on young people. And amongst other skills, it encourages a stronger understanding of media bias and develops their skills in evaluating sources and evaluating information, enabling them to navigate and critically evaluate the information that they're seeing and hearing and being exposed to, and become more informed and engaged citizens. So we work with universities at BA, MA, MSc level, but we're also increasingly engaging with the secondary school sector to develop programs with them where their young people, their students are learning about Wikipedia and the other projects, but also learning through action. They're learning to edit the encyclopedia that anyone can edit, and in doing so, really developing their own information literacy. So I'm really delighted to be here and discussing these issues with a really diverse panel of people who come from this issue from very different perspectives, and really looking forward to the discussion later on.
That's fantastic, Lucy. And it says so much about the role of open source and full disclosure, open access engagement of people at so many different levels and ages and disciplines. Bobby, fascinated to find out your perspective on navigating the information age and your approaches to that.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Waqas, for the invitation to the network. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I acquired information and my role in helping young people and my students actually navigate this world of information, or as Lucy said, disinformation. So professionally, I'm of a maths background. I'm a maths teacher. There you go, my Mr. Seagull badge. I've been teaching this morning. And I've acquired a breadth of range of knowledge across different fields. And let me tell you about my background and why people know me about knowledge. So professionally, after university initially, I actually worked in investment banking as a trader for a bank called Lehman Brothers. And I know that wasn't a great choice. We all make mistakes. Then at Nomura, and then I qualified as a chartered accountant at PwC. So if you need tax returns being done, I can help out. But I co-founded a social enterprise that supported sixth formers applying to university. And this coincided with an epiphany moment I had at PwC while teaching new graduates. And I realized I could make a sort of a greater impact on society and people around me through encouraging people to learn about the world. So at that stage, I made the decision to change careers from banking and finance into teaching. So I went to Cambridge, did my teacher training and masters, and there's where I went viral on the quiz show called University Challenge. And for those that have not heard of the show, it's a program on the BBC, been running since 1962, and Google and Wikipedia tells me it's the second oldest quiz show on television in the world. And the BBC enjoyed my performances so much that they gave me a radio show on Polymaths and my own Genius Guide road trip series. When people meet me, again, at events or sort of on road trips, etc., often one of the first things they'll say is, "Oh, Bobby, you're that really smart captain from University Challenge. Oh, you must be a genius." And in fact, I'll often tell them and say, no, I'm not a genius, but I definitely have knowledge. But it's really important to understand how I acquired the information, because I wasn't born smart or knowledgeable. When we talk about John Locke's tabula rasa, I was a blank slate. So a better question is to say, how was my tabula rasa actually filled? So I'm going to ask you to go back mentally into the 1990s. So imagine we're in the 1990s now. What's in flavor? Fluorescent coats, weird high vision sort of Walkmans and stuff. So in the 1990s, so every Saturday after lunch, my mum would make a really delicious South Indian lunch. My dad would take me and my brothers to our local library. East Ham Library was a beautiful red bricked building. In fact, when people visit East Ham, they often don't like the town too much, but the town hall is absolutely beautiful next to the library. So we'd go to the library, sit there for hours cross-legged, which I can't do now, and consume books on anything: Aztec civilization, Victorian engineering, the fantasy fiction of Tolkien. And again, as a teacher now, I might say to myself, Bobby, did you have a learning objective? Was there particular sort of intention with your reading? And I would say there wasn't anything, because our father just said, you've got this library, you've got the world at your fingertips. And back then, the internet was there, but it was more the dial wiring. So it wasn't a very good sort of internet. So it was just a sort of process of sitting and absorbing each week. And actually, my love for learning about the world came through my library visits. And normally we'd leave at 4:30 to get home in time for final football score. My club there, West Ham, would lose. So obviously that was a miserable end to the day. But it was my process of acquiring information for many years that allowed me to perform well on University Challenge. And in fact, the last thing I want to talk about before I pass on to Rand is, as a teacher, even my students will say, "Oh, Mr. Seagull, you're really smart. We can't be like you." I tell them that story of how I acquired information. And I actually tell them that it's all about developing and growing your own minds. We don't have a fixed mindset. Our minds are plastic. And in fact, the thing that I wanted to refer to was a seminal lecture by C.P. Snow. So he's a scientist turned novelist in 1959, I think, in Cambridge. And he talked about the two cultures. We've got the sciences and the humanities. And often people, when you meet them at a drinks or dinner party post-lockdown, saying, "Oh, what do you do?" Or "I'm a sciences person," or "I'm an arts creative person." And I think C.P. Snow said that in our world, the reason we don't progress in terms of solving problems as much is because we try and separate these worlds. But actually, we need to join them together. And especially in the information age nowadays, where there's again, every day there are reams of information being created. We need people, thinkers, young thinkers, adults, where they can look at information and say, I might be a scientist, but I still need my arts hat. Or I might be a creative person, but I still need to understand the logic behind it. So again, I feel very privileged to have had very good libraries growing up, but I think in this modern world, digital technology is where all the information is going to be acquired and produced.
That's an amazing story, kind of whistle stop. And I think it's really interesting that over the last years, we've seen libraries under attack. And people say, well, we've got the internet now, but there's something about having the architecture of discovery and having an environment that enables people to think freely in a way that they may not be able to do in their homes or in their own schools. Rand, really interested in your perspective on navigating the information age, especially because of your pioneering development of cognitive flexibility. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to you now to see, so we can all benefit from your insights.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the organizers of this important festival, DaVinci Network, WACAS, and so on. I'm glad to be here. I'm a cognitive scientist, an educational psychologist, and educational technologist. I study what we do in more complex and ill-structured real-world domains outside of the too often artificially neatened world of schooling and end of chapter tests and the like. We are in a world of increasing complexity, rapid change. We have to have the ability to deal adaptively with novelty pretty much everywhere we go these days. And I will just talk a little bit about some of what we do related to navigating the web to help people to better prepare to deal with novelty as they encounter it. You know, very often today we hear people like Nick Carr talking about how Google is making us stupid. I argue, and my research shows it doesn't have to be that way. Too often, yes, people use the web just for closed searches, find answers, to spare themselves the trouble of thinking. Well, what we do is we try to inculcate deep and open learning. Once you've gotten past the basic questions of information literacy, you know how to determine whether what you're working with is trustworthy information. Now, how do you change mindsets so that you get out of silos, so you get out of Google's filter bubble, so you are doing your own driving through the landscape of knowledge available to us on the web? How do you get into a collaborative relationship with the knowledge on the web? It's a kind of yin-yang process. You think you know what you're looking for, you type in some queries, then you see what the web has to say. And then what you do is say, okay, now I've got to change my queries. I've got to use Google syntax to not be directed by Google to where they want me to go or think I want to go, but instead to go where I think I need to know, so that I have a multifaceted, multi-perspectival, open, interconnected, non-siloed, polymathic view of interconnected knowledge, so that when I have to use it later, I will have many ways to play with it, to kaleidoscopically reorganize it, so that one can become more creative in how they use knowledge, deal with more complexity, hopping here, hopping there. Nonlinear learning in a principled way allows you to engage in the kind of combinatorial play of knowledge with lots of different ways of thinking simultaneously available to you, because you're going so quickly that it's within the space of cognitive spreading activation. You're primed to notice connections. All of these things, combinatorial play, priming to notice connections, are what are essential for creativity, for being able in an everyday way to deal with the novelty you're facing in a way that's not closed, where somebody else isn't telling you how to think, but you're empowered to think for yourself adaptively as you're encountering new situations. It's a kind of new use of the web for epistemic liberation, where the individual learner is empowered to go in multiple directions of the kind that they need for their purposes at different times, rather than being under the thumb of Silicon Valley teachers, Any other authorities who would tell you how to think instead of empowering you to think for yourself adaptively, flexibly, in context?
That is wonderful. So much of what you're speaking about is centered on human development. And as we now kind of come into the discussion, conversational stage of this navigating the information age topic, I really want to kind of bring into focus, actually, these paradigms of the commons of the commonwealth of the universe, of human beings being part of nature, organically, electromagnetically, shared energy, and all of the resources which are common to us all, being part of the human biospecies on this planet. Then the household, how we create habitats and how we create communities and relationships, and how those relationships foster our appreciation of the environment around us, of ourselves, and our relationships to all things. Within that is a form of learning between the commons and the household before we get to the state and the market. When we look at the state, the power structures that may have information management systems sanctioned to support centralized hierarchy of power, authority, and rulership, stratifications, caste systems of some form, be it on an ethnic line or gender lines, or in terms of social class, and levels of structural violence that enforce and restrict boundaries and barriers which have been purposely designed. Then we get to the market where a value chain of management or manual labor, hard labor, how people are valued, if they are formally meant to be dehumanized. And if they're meant to be dehumanized, is restricting access to information a part of the deal, in terms of stopping people from learning to read and write, making it illegal, or to stop women or certain children or certain types. So between the commons, the household, the state, and the market, and looking at the idea of economus and economy, the idea of the home and the the ecology of nature and our relationships. Within that are a plethora of traditions to do with how information is managed and restricted or open. So within that, we've inherited, obviously, a Jesuit system in the West that led into a Prussian PhD system, Prussian PhD system, which a lot of 2/3 of the world adopted from the 19th century into the 20th century, is a military system of education from Prussia that affected from primary education all the way through to a PhD model. And it was perfectly designed for rank and file, command and control cybernetics, in terms of how the military is structured. And that made sense for an industrial revolution on the factory industrial complex, from the manual labor and brown collar, blue collar, and white collar, and the kind of ownership. So the bottom-up uprisings, I might want to throw in, the Putney debates, kind of 17th century agreement of the people, Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, and the revolutionary Atlantic of the English revolutions and American revolutions, French Revolution, Spanish American Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. That was really about throwing off these shackles, and that every human being should be able to be a human being first, before they're classified as either a political subject, a civilian, religious subject, or a free agent. A lot of what you spoke about, Rand, has got so much to do, as I say, with that kind of the validation of the human being needing to be nothing else but a human, and to be able to engage with the commonwealth of all knowledge, and therefore to be endowed with all the tools to do so. Bobby, you know, back to the whole kind of library, but also your teaching and dealing with young minds and their curiosity, and now that they have the internet and search engines, and at the same time you have syllabuses which are very structured, and there's reports, and there's headmasters, and there's Ofsted reports, and there's similar things around the world. And then Lucy, in terms of the Wiki family and the organization of open source, full disclosure, once again comes from that tradition of learning for liberty and the validation of every human being, regardless of profession or whatever classification, that they should be able to be a fully nourished, ever human individual. And so here we are at a pivotal point in our history where people are being classified with having to be left or right or extreme or sectarian, that there is a quantizing of their identities, that the natural human identity isn't first and foremost of importance. And so there's a battle in terms of what information they should engage in, what conversations, with whom, and what sources. How do we now open up, once again, this ecology of open source, full disclosure, centered on the birthright of learning for liberty for every human being, and in so doing, create the tools and pathways for navigating the information age? I'm going to open that out to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in. So, so we talk about the human identity, individuals wanting a validation of being a human being, in the sense that they then have the ability to deal with novel issues, look at new information, assimilate it, and bring their interpretation. But I think, again, as an educator, I see issues in our schooling system, because, again, I can't speak for the entire world, but in the UK, I feel as if our schooling system is still based on the Victorian model of children sitting in rows, assimilating knowledge, rote style, which admirably plays off in quizzes. But the reality is, in the real world, you need more than just rote learning. So in some ways, you've almost dehumanized children, because they have become conduits of just absorbing knowledge, regurgitating it, and then perhaps becoming resources for the economy. And for them to gain higher levels of thinking, that sort of liberty, ability to challenge and be skeptical about things they see in the world, they need that, as Lucy was talking about, not just consumers of information, but the ability to be producers of information. But again, this is like almost like I'm in torn minds, because whilst I realize we need to enable people to have a higher level of thinking, let me give you some sort of sobering facts about UK's level of literacy and numeracy. So numeracy in particular. So when we're looking at nowadays sort of the modern data age, especially during COVID, we're seeing lots of data about R rates and infections per 100,000 people. So we've seen numbers come to the fore. So as a maths teacher, I'll say one benefit of COVID, if there's few, is that people are sort of understanding the importance of maths literacy. But in the United Kingdom, 50% of adults, 50%, 1 in 2, have the numeracy skills that the government set out for 11-year-olds at primary school. So these are adults that are navigating the information age, and yet their numeracy skills are there at what an 11-year-old should be. So we talk about, we're trying to, on one hand, we want to liberate people so that they can be empowered to think and deal with novel situations and be producers of information, not just consumers. But at the same time, we've got people who are being left behind, and they're not even able to consume the information.
That's really interesting, Bobby, because, you know, as you're speaking, I started to think about the power of coding. And in where we are right now, we're in an age where we need an ecology of power whereby people are able to participate in power. And in many, many ways now, that means, especially for younger generations, millennials and such, being able to participate in coding and having an ability to be able to generate the algorithms that represent the best traits of human behavior. And which is very different from if one was going to be working in a shop where they had to add up, know the prices of things. Now, obviously, people have calculators, but the idea of the use of maths and what you need to learn. There's so many people say, well, I've never used algebra in my life. Why did I have to learn all of that? And I didn't know how to do my tax returns. So the idea of people understanding why it's important now, what certain learning skills were in a factory industrial complex and in hierarchical organizations of management structures. Now that we're moving into a different paradigm because of technology, because of AI, because of robots, we no longer need robotic humans. Those tasks are being replaced by AI. And we now need to recalibrate and repurpose the other perhaps neglected cognitive facilities. But like Lucy, I saw you were about to jump in there.
I mean, there's so much from what both of you are saying. Sorry, I was obviously leaning forward. I mean, this incredibly domestic note, this conversation just feels so live for my family. So I have a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old, and my husband and I yesterday were just talking about the fact that he and I, you know, we don't have to work out what 7 times 8 is, because we learnt timetables by rote, so we just know. And the different approaches that my 8-year-old is learning at school, and that my husband, who's doing most of the home learning, is trying to develop. It's just been quite an interesting conversation, and really speaks to some of those things. But at a broader level, and probably a more strategic level, listening to both you, Paul, and Bobby, I was thinking back to my time working for Creative Partnerships, which was a very huge programme, £40 million a year, that the government at the time, the Labour government, invested in creative teaching and learning. And I was the director of the West London area. So we're working in schools with children from largely quite deprived backgrounds, and investing in their learning. But the essence of it was creative practitioners, so people like Paul, composers, musicians, dancers, visual artists, working in schools. But more often than not, they were working on science or maths subjects. So it wasn't the dance practitioner teaching, you know, the PE teacher. It was actually about how do you use the processes that a musician goes through to create, to enable young people to understand scientific concepts better. And we used to talk about the fact that the curriculum in 2006 was essentially the same as the curriculum in 1806, and yet the jobs that the kids we were engaging with were going to do hadn't yet been invented. And the young people who are engaged with creative partnerships are now in the working world, and we'll be doing jobs that back in 2006-07, when I was leading that programme in West London, I hadn't heard of. So I think there is something in there which is about how do we make sure that we are focused on developing skills, creative thinking, critical thinking, you know, all sorts of different skills, but also enabling people to use their skills to acquire and apply knowledge. And I think thinking of it as skills versus knowledge is the wrong way around, and it is about how do you develop the skills that Bobby did at a young age to enable him to acquire that knowledge and to apply that knowledge. But that also made me think about Wikipedia, which there are 56 million articles on Wikipedia. That's a huge amount of knowledge and information. However, there are flaws within that. And one of the things that we're very aware of as a movement is that largely that knowledge and information is perpetuating dominant forms of knowledge and Western bias. And we're working very hard as a movement to think about how we offset that and how we make sure that it is genuinely the sum of all knowledge. But I have to be honest and say at the moment it isn't. So coming back to Bobby's point that there are people who could not be the producers of knowledge and would struggle to adequately consume knowledge, well, there's a responsibility on behalf of the producers of open knowledge to ensure that that is as accurate and unbiased as possible, so that even people who don't have advanced information and media literacy skills are getting a neutral and comprehensive introduction to a subject, and Wikipedia is fulfilling its function as a source aggregator. But I think you highlighted a really important issue, which is at the one end, we've got people who would identify as being polymaths and who have, through luck, skill, choice, background, etc., have got to that point of being able to draw on all of their their learning, their skills and their knowledge to forge a really important path. And then there are a subset of people in this country and others who are being left behind. And I'm not sure how we comprehensively embrace both of those ends of the spectrum, if you like.
Amazing. That leads really nicely into to Rand, because as a cognitive scientist and educational psychologist, and I'm sure that you've got a lot to say both in the informal setting and also with informal education, but also you have a concept of, I guess, the biopsychosocial model. And we're in an age now where we do understand a lot more about at least the triune brain of our gut brain and the heart brain and head brain, and how they kind of work, and we know something more about the biochemistry that underpins our behavior, as it were, the biopsychology and neuroscience of our behavior, even to the point of cortisol and neurotransmitters and dopamine and endorphins and all that sort of stuff, what parts of the brain they activate, if it's more of an amygdala, reptilian brain, fight, flight, freeze mode, or how much engages the corpus callosum, left brain, right brain, into the neocortex. But also, pretext and context I want to kind of ask, because I've noticed when I've taught or done auditions, stuff like BBC to whatever else, going into a classroom with young people are not accustomed to being validated, to their imagination being validated. You ask them a question, they suddenly become afraid, because there's a pretext or context that they're either going to get, there's carrot and a stick, they could get in trouble, it could be the wrong answer, people would laugh. And then when the bell rings and they run into a playground, you see exuberant liberation. And I wanted to see that liberation from the playground in the classroom, but I knew that that wasn't welcomed by the institution. So just in terms of not just humans' cognitive abilities, but also the design constructs that can restrict human learning capacity situationally or liberate it. Interesting to see what you've got to say along those lines.
Well, indeed, I do believe that we are an inherently adaptive, creative species. Our brains grew the most during a time of, on a evolutionary scale, relatively rapid climate change. Our adaptive skill was adaptation. Gets cold, we figure out how to kill animals and use their hides for warmth, et cetera, et cetera. You observe children. Lucy, I know you've been talking about your kids, and long before kids get to school, they are endlessly creative in how to manipulate their parents, how to go out in the schoolyard and try to have their way. They're always solving problems. Then you get to school, and for the reasons you identified earlier, Paul, the historical influence of the factory industrial complex, military, and so on, in the development of schooling. Yes, we have knocked that creativity, that imagination out of kids via schooling. But I am sanguine about the prospects for change, even in inertia-ridden an institution as schooling, because right now we have this propitious confluence of influences from the corporate world, from the military. Or, if you look at the World Economic Foundation forecasting, you're not going to be able to get a good job in 5 years unless you're able to be an adaptive problem solver, deal with novelty, be creative. Schools will change because now the corporations, the military at every level has become a sort of horizontal organization, electronic battlefields, whatever, or sandstorms, where you have to do plane maintenance or whatever. Everybody at every level of rank in the military wants adaptive flexibility. You need adaptive flexibility and ability to innovate throughout the corporate world. So now we're actually getting some pressure on schools to change in a more creative and a more humanistic way. Liberal arts education is becoming valued. As you say, we've got artificial intelligence coming. Anything that's algorithmic, determinate, predictable, is going to be really well done by smart machines. All right. But, and smart machines are smart at lots of things, but they're not very smart at asking for a big salary to do what they do. They'll do it for free. They're going to get those jobs. People are going to need to learn how to become more creative, more adaptive, more flexible. We now have flexible digital random access media, including the web. These new media, paraphrasing McLuhan, make possible a new cognitive message, a cognitive message of escaping from silos, escaping from predetermined kinds of right answer tests. The world doesn't go in a line. The world isn't organized into chapters. The world very often doesn't have right answers. And the pressure is on schooling to use the new media to make learners better able to deal with ambiguity, to deal with complexity, to deal with novelty. Schools will change because now they have to change. And ironically, that pressure from change is going to come from the very places that made schooling so rigid in the first place and now need it not to be so rigid.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Now, I know that we have so many of our viewers that have got some questions that they definitely want to kind of chime in. So I'm going to be getting those questions momentarily, looking forward to that, to seeing those. But it's in terms of looking at the future of natural human intelligence in the age of artificial intelligence, and actually what intelligence is and what the role of understanding and, dare I say, wisdom, what's the role of kind of wisdom in our age? Will we see algorithmic wisdom? Also, just in terms of structures, old structures, legacy systems where we have fear-based, regimented, trauma-based condition, carrot stick learning incentives that can go across the household and the state and the market. If we're needing a very different kind of human, we're going to need the kind of anthropology, cultural anthropology and social psychology that engenders an acceleration towards this kind of liberated context. So I want to kind of throw, whilst I'm waiting for questions to come in, I want to throw that out to the three of you in terms of how you see, how do we now move towards the design thinking of how we can enhance and accelerate the kind of learning and cognitive tools for navigating information on the basis that we know that we're moving more and more into an artificial intelligence to artificial general intelligence world, and we need to now redirect the development and potentials of natural human intelligence.
So,
Bobby.
can I kick off on this? So like, I think the word algorithm can scare many people, my students or people in the real world, like, oh, algorithms are taking over the world. But at its most simple, an algorithm is just a list of rules to solve a problem in a particular order. So for example, all of us this morning had to get dressed. And imagine you were going out to grab milk or something. So you'd put on if you put on your coat before your jumper, you'd obviously be in trouble because you got to put your jumper on, then the coat. And again, that's a really simple algorithm. If going out, wear jumper first, then coat afterwards. So at its basic, algorithms are just a set of instructions. And computers, as they've become, was it through Graham's law? I forget the one, Moore's law. As they become increasingly more powerful, I've just become a lot better at us than doing it. So again, when we look at, I still am, I used to be a huge chess fan. So I'm in the early mid 90s in England, there was Nigel Short versus Garry Kasparov on Channel 4. And it's amazing. I wish those days would come back. I'd come back from school and you see on primetime telly, chess matches on television. But back then, so Garry Kasparov at the pinnacle of his powers, And they thought computers can never beat someone like Garry Kasparov, you know, too intricate thinking. And then in 1997, we saw IBM's Deep Blue defeat Kasparov. And then there's people said, okay, it's chess. Chess only has 64 spaces on a board. Go is a more complicated game. There's, you know, humans could always beat computers. And a few years ago, I think Seagull, the top player in Go, was defeated by Demos Hassibis's AI system. So I think when it's something to do with a automated algorithm where we're making decisions one by one, computers will beat us. So again, where we need to find the value as humans, individuals, is again, consume the information from Wikipedia, open sources, but then teach people, not the skills, but the ability to produce the information. Because for now, I don't think computers can produce the knowledge. I mean, at some stage they might do. We might be in Terminator 2 situation, but for now, we are the people that can produce the knowledge.
That's so interesting, Buddy. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about the lens of us as a bioelectromagnetic anthropomorphic computer, which is capable of multiple hyperdimensional computations in every single millisecond. Indeed, the human body is ingenious. We are, in fact, a conglomerate species, a system of systems. In a way, every human being is a superorganism. The microbes, the DNA, which is not human, that we host, that also is trying to manifest its directives through the human body. We have a mind management in place to stop cognitive error, yet from language to what our neurotransmitters want our bodies to do, to external stimuli that we're receiving, we are doing the most complex computations. But we are not converting that activity into our cognitive understanding of our own superorganism system, which is no less complex, actually, than the systems of the biosphere of which we are a part. So all of this stuff about, you know, we're mathematically modeling things which are happening, you know, computational biology and all of these things where, like, we're kind of looking at what the human body's doing, how it's receiving signals, frequencies and all of this sort of stuff. Like, you know, where super intelligence or supercomputers, quantum computers are nowhere near what we're doing in every second as human beings. Yet we haven't had a learning context just for every human being to actually appreciate how their body works, how their minds work, how their emotions work, how their spirituality works, and how they exist in the world, even from a level of a bio-psycho-spiritual social model. So Rand, this kind of goes back into your area, because we now need to have this appreciation of ourselves. We're a pretty amazing supercomputer, quantum computer, what have you, but we haven't been given a context of learning and doing that allows us to really use and to understand what's going on within us. How do we get there?
Well, our incredibly powerful brain, so well described by you, Paul, just now, can be guided in different ways. What we don't talk often enough about are mindsets, worldviews, ways of thinking. We take for granted too often a reductive worldview. Works very well for more well-structured, orderly, determinate domains, ones that are amenable to scripted, algorithmic, step-by-step, sequential thinking. However, very often we have to deal with a world that doesn't fit with this wish for cognitive security, for cognitive ease, for order, for predictability. What do we do then? Well, we need totally opposite kinds of meta features of worldview, an expansive and adaptive worldview that values, and we can teach these cognitive epistemic values, that values interconnectedness rather than compartmentalization, linear separability, additivity, that values synthetic wholeness, situations we deal with the cases we encounter in the world, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we have to figure out how that emergent whole can be understood in its novelty, in its moment. We have to figure out how to assemble from bits and pieces of prior knowledge and experience a schema for the moment, a schema for this situation, instead of having an epistemic worldview or mindset that says you've got some frame, some schema, some script in your head, a template that you can retrieve from long-term memory and instantiate with the details of the world out. No, you don't have a prepackaged schema telling you how to think and act for all the situations you encounter. You have to have a mindset for creativity, for building for the moment, for assembly in a situation adaptive way. These are different ways of thinking. They have to be learned in different ways. They're both important. Some are, the reductive worldview is important in all those areas where it's had such great success, where you have, mathematical determination, where you have right answers, where you have additivity, separable components. But for a lot of the rest of the world, including the messy real world we deal with all the time, that's changing, that's complex, we need a different mindset. We have to teach ways of thinking, epistemic mindsets, worldviews that are very often at odds, opposite in their key features to the ones we emphasize in schooling today. New media, again, make possible a new cognitive message of flexibility, of nonlinearity, of adaptivity, of creativity. We need to harness those in learning in school and out.
Absolutely. That so much touches on, I guess, the difference in learning for the sovereign individual that can therefore deploy parts of their asset portfolio of cognitive tools and micro-technologies to the or the state or to any of constituency, but is not limited by any one of the requirements, and they will be able to render onto Caesar. Now, I've got an interesting question from Matthew. This is for you, Bobby, and he's asking, how do adults who've been through all of the conditioning, rote learning, how do they unlearn? How do you envisage ways for adults who've been through that kind of training, shall we say, or even more of an education? How do they unlearn that? Or better, shall I say, what is the transitory measures from that rote memorizing answers into this connected, collaborative mindset? And when will it be available?
That's a real challenge, because again, with young people, often when students make mistakes, I say, don't worry, your prefrontal cortex hasn't been fully developed. By the time it's 25, then you can, then I'll blame you for your mistakes. But till then, your mind is still developing. So once you're, in theory, once you're past the age of 25, that's developed. So it becomes more difficult to influence the way we think. But again, I've done a lot of work by a lady called Carol Dweck in the United States. So she's a psychologist and done work on growth mindset and plasticity, and how often people think they've got a fixed mindset, saying, oh, I could never do maths at school, and that's it. But she's shown through research that actually our brains are plastic, neuroplastic. We can rebuild parts of our brain and invigorate bits that weren't used as much at school. So again, when we're trying to overcome our rote learning methodology that was suited to the sort of factory industrial complex, it's not easy, but people can do it. And again, it's mindset as well. If you have the growth mindset, whether you're 70, 80, 90, you can still pick up a new skill. Again, in lockdown, we've seen a lot of people learning to bake banana bread or learning how to knit amazing jumpers. And these are skills that perhaps people didn't have pre-lockdown. So I think it's a case of, it's partly psychological. People need to have that attitude, yes, I can improve in something. And also almost to adopt that growth mindset where this actually, perhaps I don't have the skill set competency now, but I can develop it. So it's, again, if I knew the answer very easy, I'd be having a best-selling book globally about this, but maybe one day.
Well, I'm sure that you will. There's another interesting question from Alex, who's asking about the downsides in the emphasis on STEM subjects. as opposed to, I guess, what we're talking about now is not the subject, but the human computation and how it can use different modalities of cognition to solve problems, and the convertibility from mathematics to linguistics and engineering as actually design, and technology as the mathematical modeling of systems that they can be generated in zeros and ones into, and in science from its sciare, to know, which therefore is about ways of knowing. How do we, I guess, imbue STEM with arts and humanities cognitive practice?
Well, there is a field called STEAM with the A that relates to arts. It's interesting to see how people in STEM itself are starting to say more and more scientific, mathematical, engineering, problem solving does require additional ways and different ways of thinking to complement the more traditional reductive ways. And engineers like Petrosky write books called "To Engineer is Human," with a picture of a bridge in the state of Washington collapsing into the water. Every bridge building site has its own unique, you might say, clinical features that have to be adapted to climatological conditions, traffic conditions, the sediment the pillars are going to be sunk into, and so on. There is a movement now towards applying more arts-like thinking to creative problem solving in scientific and STEM more generally situations. It has to be there because you can't think in terms of the next generation science standards that involve themes like systems, unless you go beyond the more traditional limitations of STEM approaches. I think there's a receptive field to hearing what's being said here about science and math.
That leads perfectly into a question from Christina, one of our listeners, and is really, as you just said, about limits, but also, Lucy, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Are there limits to human creativity and cognitive flexibility? Question.
Gosh, I mean, I don't claim to be enough of a polymath to be able to answer that question. I feel like if there are limits, we certainly haven't reached them, would be my answer to that question. And if my dad is an educationalist, and I remember him talking to me years ago about the fact that it was at the time when GCSE and A-level results kept on getting better in this country, and people were saying, oh, they're obviously dumbing down, the questions are easier. And my dad said, no, of course they're not easier. We're just getting better at learning, and we've got more information, we've got more access. And I think that's true today, and infinitely more access to information and knowledge than we had during that conversation. So I think if there are limits to cognitive flexibility and human creativity, then I certainly don't know what those limits are, but I feel we haven't yet reached them. I'm sure there are individuals who are absolutely pushing the boundaries of their own limits, but most of us probably exist in at a point where we're really only using a small amount of our cognitive potential. And that speaks to something that Rand was talking about actually in our call yesterday, about the fact that in some ways the internet replaces the need for that deep thinking. And we have to find ways of utilizing new technology, utilizing the internet in ways that enable that deep and open learning and not a barrier to it or some sort of replacement for it. I also just felt that there was a tension, completely agreed with what Rand was saying earlier about the need for a schema for now and a mindset for creativity. In my mind, there's a slight tension between that, which I completely agree with, and this false equivalence that we have now between an opinion and fact. having conversation, for example, about vaccinating our children, and a fellow mum saying to me, my friend's opinion that she shouldn't have her children vaccinated is equally as valid as the people that are trying to tell you to be vaccinated. Well, I'm sorry, unless they're, biologist or whatever, actually it's not. That opinion is not as valid. And yet that sort of seems to sit, not necessarily in tension, but is a complicating factor in Rand's vision. So sorry, I realised we were at time, so I'm going to stop speaking now.
I would just say you need both. Sometimes there is a right answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, wear masks. Yes, get vaccinated. Other times there isn't a right answer. Should I get a haircut? My kids said they were going to disappear if I ever grew a ponytail. They're being very understanding because it's the pandemic. Can you go to the doctor? Can you go shopping? We have to do all kinds of imperfect problem solving using the science. So sometimes there is a right answer. Sometimes the reductive approach is correct. Yes, wear masks. Do you go to get a haircut? It depends.
Yeah.
So it's this other side that we have to prepare better people for, the it depends side, the context sensitive side, the side where you have to figure out what are the costs, what are the risks, what's the whole profile of considerations that have to be somehow subjectively balanced, because there isn't a right answer.
Thank you.
That gives me so much to think about as we kind of come now to a closing, to kind of surmise with a conversation which could go on. But it goes straight back to the title of this session, Navigating the Information Age. And for a nation that has so many world-class universities, especially those in terms of science as well, the nation has not produced a site, peer-reviewed site, written by all the universities in our nation to navigate COVID. All the science, it hasn't. It could, but it hasn't. So we have august institutions capable of producing quality information, but it hasn't done so. With Brexit, people were able to believe that 350 million would go into the National Health Service. That information was out there. There wasn't anything to counteract, and BBCs and universities, etc., could have chimed in. They didn't. In America, they've had QAnon. And great minds, professors, white collar workers, down to people in rural America, have gone down a rabbit hole, algorithmically driven. And somewhere between our abilities of censors and transmitters, receiving indications from emails of what we trust, what we don't trust, is based upon rational thinking, but more kind of how we process emotion, intuition, etc. How we navigate the information age, just 30 seconds each. And with all things considered, where do we go from here? Anyone?
I think more collaboration, more intersectionality of discussion and thinking, bringing people like the three of us today, the four of us today talking. I think the only way we're going to do this is less than 30 seconds, I think, is to talk more and to different types of people.
Multiple perspectives, harmoniously, almost aesthetically coordinated, not reduced to some common denominator.
I think we should try to engage young people on the platforms they're on. Again, when I talk to my students, where do they consume information about what's happening in Corona? It could be a TikTok story where saying, attend this session now, otherwise. So it's finding where people are and disseminating information there as well.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much to the DaVinci Network for putting on this great inaugural Polymath Festival. Thank you to Waqas Ahmed. founder of the DaVinci Network, and also the author of the book Polymath, for inviting us all. And I'm sure we've been given some glowing reports from our listeners on our conversation. It just serves me now my great pleasure to thank you all for your great contributions. And may this conversation continue, and may we all use our efforts to a social and cultural utility of humanity in being able to deploy greater optimized cognitive flexibility and psychotechnologies of being. Thank you all so much.